You're still here? I thought you'd have more self-respect than this.
Charles had a rough night.
That stopped being your problem the moment I signed those papers.
Madeline.
I'm not doing this again, Dad. I've wasted enough years watching you two choose each other over everything else.
Where are you going?
Somewhere my life can actually begin. Preston's waiting.
I'll stay.
This house won't be yours much longer.
She said it the way someone cancels a subscription. No anger, no hesitation, just done. I watched Madeline walk out of that hospital room without a single look back. The ring on the table, Preston's car outside, every piece already in place. She told me this house would not be mine much longer. She believed it completely. But Charles was still in that bed, still breathing, still watching. I had learned in all those months beside him that quiet men choose very carefully who they leave things to. So what had he already decided before she walked out that door? If this story is the kind you stay for, hit subscribe and come back for what happens next. You won't want to miss it. The first time Charles Whitaker told me I wasn't what he had in mind for his daughter. We were standing in his kitchen in the middle of winter, and he said it the way a man says the weather is disappointing, not cruel, just honest. He wasn't wrong about what he saw. I wasn't ambitious in the way he understood ambition. I didn't wear a watch that cost more than a car or talk about portfolio positioning over dinner. I restored old wood. I kept broken things from falling apart. To a man who had built a shipyard from nothing that probably looked like a man going nowhere slowly. But I loved his daughter, and for a long time that was enough to keep me in the room. Madeline and I had built something quiet together in Annapolis, a house close enough to the water that you could hear it at night. A life that didn't ask much of the world and didn't get much back from it either. She had her work in marketing. I had my projects, and somewhere in between we had carved out a kind of peace that felt for a long stretch of years like the real thing. I wasn't chasing a bigger version of my life. I thought she felt the same way about hers. Charles warmed to me slowly the way old buildings reveal themselves one layer at a time, never all at once. It wasn't until the 3rd or 4th year of our marriage that he stopped testing me in quiet ways and started talking to me like someone he expected to see again. I think what changed it was something small. His truck broke down one February and Madeline couldn't get away from work, so I drove 40 minutes in the dark to bring him home and then stayed to fix a water pipe that had been leaking since November. He never mentioned it again. But after that, something shifted between us, and it stayed shifted. By the time the doctors found the lesions on his lungs, Charles and I had become something neither of us had a clean word for. Not quite father and son, not just in-laws. Something that existed in the space between reliability and trust, built entirely out of years of showing up when it wasn't convenient. The diagnosis came fast and landed hard. Stage 4, pulmonary fibrosis. The kind of prognosis where the doctors don't talk about recovery, only about managing the timeline. Charles had maybe 6 months, they said, though. The way he carried it, you would have thought they'd told him he had a scheduling conflict rather than a death sentence. He thanked the doctor, asked 2 specific questions about his breathing medication, and drove himself home. Madeline didn't take it the same way. She cried for 3 days and then went quiet in a way that looked like composure but wasn't. She told me she couldn't watch him decline. That being in hospitals made her feel like she was already losing him, and she couldn't live inside that feeling every single day. I understood that, or I tried to. Grief takes people in different directions, and I didn't think less of her for not being able to sit in those rooms. I thought she just needed time to find her way into it, so I started going without her. I rearranged my project schedule and handed 2 restorations off to Dale Ostrowski, a man I'd worked alongside for nearly a decade. We'd met on a job in Eastport and had stayed close through the kind of friendship built on shared work and honest conversation. Handing those projects to Dale cost me months of income, but I didn't think about it in those terms at the time. I just needed the hours free, and Dale was the only person I trusted with the work. I made Charles's medical appointments the center of my week. I learned his medication routine, which pills at what time, which ones made him dizzy, which ones he'd try to skip because he didn't like how they made his hands feel. I kept a notebook. I learned how to read the oxygen monitor. I learned what a bad night looked like before it became a crisis, and I learned how to talk him through the worst of the breathing episodes without making him feel diminished in the process. Charles hated being managed. He hated feeling weak, so I never treated him like he was either of those things. I just showed up, did what needed doing, and let him set the terms of whatever conversation we were going to have. Some nights we talked for hours about the old shipyard, how he'd built it with his father in the early 1970s. What the water smelled like in the mornings back then, which workers had stayed 30 years, and which ones he'd had to let go. Other nights we sat in silence with the television on, and that was enough too. He said once around the third month, "You don't have to keep doing this, Aaron." I told him I knew that. He said most men would have found a reason to stop by now. I told him I wasn't looking for a reason to stop. He nodded and didn't say anything else. But after that, he stopped telling me I didn't have to be there. Madeline, by that point, was coming home at different times than she used to. Small differences at first an hour, here a dinner, she said, ran long. A weekend trip she described as a team retreat. I didn't press it. I was tired, and pressing things required energy I was using elsewhere. I told myself she was processing her father's illness in her own way, building a wall between herself and the grief. I had seen people do stranger things when faced with losing someone they loved. Then I found the email chain. I wasn't looking for it. I was using her laptop to print a medical form for Charles's next appointment, and a browser tab was still open from the night before. A name I didn't recognize, Preston Langford. Dozens of messages. A thread that went back 5 months into a period before Charles had even been diagnosed, into a time when Madeline had been quieter than usual, and I had assumed it was work pressure. The language in those messages didn't belong in a professional correspondence and didn't leave much open to interpretation. I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about confronting her that night. I thought about calling Dale and telling him what I'd found. Instead, I drove to the hospital, sat with Charles through a particularly rough evening, watched a nature documentary about migratory birds with him until he fell asleep, and drove home in the dark. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew that whatever I did, I wasn't going to do it in a rage. Madeline's disappearances became more structured after that. The trips got longer. She stopped pretending they were work. Preston Langford was, I came to understand, a real estate developer with the kind of money that got buildings named after him. Hotels along the mid-Atlantic coast. Marina developments, the sort of man whose name appeared in business sections next to words like visionary and aggressive growth strategy. He was also, I would later understand, specifically interested in 14 acres of waterfront property on the Chesapeake Bay property that had belonged to the Whitaker family for 3 generations, and that Charles had absolutely no intention of selling. The morning Madeline brought the separation papers to the hospital. I had been awake since 4 in the morning helping Charles through a respiratory episode that had required an emergency call to his care team. By the time his breathing steadied, the sun was already up, and I was sitting in a plastic chair outside his room drinking bad coffee from a machine at the end of the hallway. She walked in around 9, dressed well, her hair done the way she only did it when she was going somewhere that mattered to her. She put an envelope on the chair next to me without sitting down. I looked at the envelope and then looked at her. She told me she was moving to Baltimore, that the marriage was over, that she had already arranged for her things to be collected from the house, and that she expected me to be out within the month. She said it quickly, like she had practiced it, like she wanted to get through the words before the weight of them could slow her down. I asked if she was sure she wanted to do this now with her father in the room just down the hall with the monitors still running from the night before. She said she had wasted enough years waiting for a life she actually wanted. She said it not angry, not guilty, just resolved. The way someone sounds when they have made a decision so completely that the conversation is merely the paperwork of it. What she didn't know was that Charles had heard everything. The door to his room had been open. He heard her voice, and he heard mine, heard every word she said, including the ones about Preston and Baltimore and the life she had decided she deserved. By the time I walked back into his room, Charles was lying very still and staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man trying to understand something that keeps refusing to make sense. I sat down in the chair beside him. I didn't explain what had just happened. He had heard it. We both knew that. After a long stretch of silence, he asked me why I was still there. I told him that what had just happened between me and Madeline didn't change the fact that he'd had a hard night and that someone needed to make sure his oxygen levels stayed stable through the morning. He looked at me like I had said something in a language he wasn't expecting to hear. He said, "That's not a real answer." I thought about it for a moment and then said, "What's happening with Madeline and me that's between us? What's happening with you and me is something different. Those aren't the same thing." He didn't respond right away. He turned his face toward the window, and outside Annapolis was doing whatever it does on a Tuesday morning in spring, moving forward unbothered. After a while, he said almost to himself, "I spent 30 years wondering what kind of man she'd end up with. I never thought I'd get the answer this way." In the weeks that followed, everything around me began to reorganize itself in ways I hadn't anticipated. Adeline's relatives' cousins I had known for years, an aunt in Easton who had come to our wedding people. I had driven to airports and helped move furniture for started treating me with a particular kind of distance, the kind that isn't hostile, but is designed to make clear that you are no longer inside the circle. I was becoming, in the vocabulary of Madeline's family, the soon-to-be ex-husband. A transitional figure, someone to be managed and moved past. Madeline's lawyer sent a formal letter requesting that I vacate the waterfront property, citing her expectation of inheritance rights. The letter was polite and procedural and made it clear that any continued presence in the home would be considered an overstep. I read it at Charles's kitchen table, put it down, made myself a cup of coffee, and drove to the hospital. Charles was having a better day. He was sitting up, which was always a good sign. He had a physical therapy visit scheduled and had been annoyed about it, which was also a good sign. Charles only complained about things when he had the energy to care. I sat down and told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting the way he did when he was thinking, rather than when he was being polite. When I finished, he looked at me for a long time before he spoke. He said he had one request to make of me and that I was free to decline it. I told him to say what it was. He asked me to stay until he died. Not for the house. Not for anything legal or financial. He said he simply did not want to spend the time he had left surrounded only by people who were calculating what they were going to get when he was gone. He said he knew what he was asking, and he knew it wasn't a small thing given everything that had happened. I thought about all the reasons it would have been reasonable to say no. The marriage was over. The house was contested. Every day I stayed, I was making myself a cleaner target for Madeline's narrative about who I was and why I was there. Dale had already mentioned gently that people were starting to talk, that it looked strange, that maybe I should think about my own interests for once. I understood all of that. But Charles Whitaker was 67 years old and dying of a disease that was slowly collapsing his lungs from the inside, and he had just asked me to stay because he didn't want to face the end of his life with only people who were waiting for it to be over. I told him I would stay. What happened next didn't feel like a decision about property or inheritance or any of the things Madeline's lawyer was now putting into formal language. It felt like the only thing I could do and still be the person I thought I was. So I stayed. I showed up every morning, managed the medications, handled the paperwork and the phone calls and the negotiations with the care team. And I stopped thinking about the house or the letter or what Preston Langford was offering Madeline in Baltimore. I stopped trying to save the marriage. There was nothing left of it to save. What I was trying to do from that point forward was simply keep a promise to a man who had asked me for the one thing nobody else in his life was willing to give him. Some things are like that. You don't decide them. You just recognize them. The story that Madeline started telling about me spread the way those stories always do, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. It didn't announce itself. It arrived through small changes, a cousin who used to text me about football going silent, an aunt who had always been warm at family gatherings suddenly finding reasons to be in another room when I walked in. At the hospital, one of Charles's regular nurses mentioned carefully that she'd had a conversation with a family member about my role in his care. She said the word role the way you say it when you mean something else entirely. I understood what was happening. I just didn't know how organized it had already become. Madeline was telling people I had isolated Charles from his family, that I controlled his access to visitors, screened his phone calls, managed his medications in ways designed to keep him dependent and confused. She framed every act of caregiving as a calculation, every hour I had spent in that hospital room recast as a move in a longer game I was supposedly playing. The medication notebook I kept got described in one version I heard secondhand as evidence that I was monitoring what Charles said and to whom. The calls I had made to Margaret Doyle on Charles's behalf, routine legal consultations he had specifically asked me to arrange, became in Madeline's telling a son-in-law quietly repositioning himself inside the estate. The most damaging piece was a bank transfer. Charles had asked me to facilitate a payment to the family of a retired shipyard worker named Gerald Mack, whose wife had just been diagnosed with cancer. It wasn't a large amount, just something Charles wanted done quickly and without fuss, because that was how he did things. He didn't make gestures. He made decisions. I processed the transfer the same afternoon he asked. 2 weeks later, Madeline was showing a printout of the transaction to her lawyer and 2 family members presenting it as evidence that money was leaving Charles's accounts through me without proper authorization. I found out about it from Dale. He called on a Wednesday morning and his voice was careful from the first sentence. Dale Ostrowski had been my closest friend in the trade for nearly a decade, the kind of man who said what he thought without much packaging, which I had always appreciated. He told me what Madeline was circulating, and he wasn't diplomatic about how serious it was getting. He said he believed me. He also said that believing me and being able to argue it effectively in front of a room of people who had already decided otherwise were 2 completely different things. He wasn't wrong. I just didn't have a better answer. Madeline's next move was more formal. She requested a cognitive capacity evaluation for Charles, a clinical assessment, to determine whether he was still competent to make his own legal and financial decisions. The implication was clear: if Charles was declared mentally incapacitated, Madeline could petition for guardianship and effectively control his assets while he was still alive. The shipyard land, the waterfront house, all of it would move into a legal arrangement where she, not Charles, would have the authority to sign. The evaluation was conducted by 2 physicians over the course of an afternoon. Charles, who had always found condescension to be physically intolerable, answered every question with the flat precision of a man who had spent 50 years making decisions that had consequences. When one of the doctors asked him to describe what month it was, Charles named the month, the date, and the current interest rate on 30-year Treasury bonds. They cleared him without qualification. But the attempt itself had done something. Charles had learned about the evaluation request before the doctors arrived. Margaret had informed him through proper legal channels. That evening, after the physicians left, he was quiet, in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the quiet of exhaustion, but the quiet of a man who has just understood something he had been trying not to understand. He said without preamble, "She's not waiting for me to die peacefully." I didn't confirm it or deny it. I just sat with him until he was ready to say something else. He didn't say anything else that night. It was about 2 weeks after that when Charles told me he wanted to go to the old shipyard. He said it on a Wednesday evening in the tone he used when a decision had already been made and he was simply informing me of it. I arranged a car and helped him into it and drove the route that took us along the water because he liked to see the bay when he could. The Whitaker Marine Works had been closed for nearly 7 years. The building was still standing. Charles had maintained the structure even after operations wound down, which I had always taken as a sign that he hadn't entirely made peace with letting it go. The wooden dock needed work. The paint on the exterior was weathered to silver. But the bones of it were solid, the way things built in the early 1970s tended to be before shortcuts became standard practice. Margaret Doyle was already inside when we arrived. She was sitting at the old front desk with a folder in front of her, and she greeted Charles the way people greet someone they've been expecting. No surprise, no ceremony, just the practical warmth of a long, working relationship. Seeing her there in that closed building on a Wednesday night told me this visit had been planned considerably further in advance than Charles had let on. Charles settled into a chair that had clearly been set out for him, and then he started talking. He told me that the shipyard land was not simply a real estate asset. He had been working quietly and for some time on a plan to convert a portion of the property into a vocational training center, a facility for the children of former shipyard workers, for veterans who needed a trade, for people trying to rebuild something after a hard stretch. He had spoken to 2 community colleges and a veterans organization about partnership structures. He had already identified the retired craftsmen who had told him individually that they would come back to teach if he ever opened something like this. Preston Langford wanted to demolish every inch of it to build a waterfront resort and private marina. Charles showed me the purchase offer, the kind of number that would make any reasonable person consider. Then he showed me something, a set of documents compiled by Margaret over the preceding months, tracing a series of financial inquiries and property information requests that had been routed to Preston's acquisition team. The source of those inquiries was someone with access to the Whitaker family's internal financial records, someone who knew the acreage, the zoning classifications, the current assessed value, and the outstanding maintenance costs on the building. The transmission had begun nearly a year earlier, before Charles was diagnosed, before the separation papers, before any of it, which meant that whatever I had believed about Madeline gradually losing herself to grief, and a man who offered her something bigger, that wasn't quite the whole story. The whole story was longer and colder than that. I wanted to confront her immediately. Charles put his hand on the table between us, which was his way of saying, "Not yet." He said, "Don't fight to prove they're dishonest. Give them enough room to prove it themselves." Then he asked Margaret to prepare an envelope. I watched her take a single folded document from her folder and seal it inside. Charles picked up a pen and wrote on the outside in his handwriting, which was still firm and deliberate, even at this stage, "To be opened after I am gone." He didn't tell me what was inside. I didn't ask. I drove him back to the hospital that night with a different understanding of the situation than I'd had that morning. I knew Charles was clear about what was happening around him. I knew he had already taken steps I wasn't aware of. What I didn't know was what those steps meant for anyone specifically, including me. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of myself. I was thinking about the training center that didn't exist yet, the veterans who didn't know someone had already put their names in a plan, the retired craftsmen who had said yes to a building that was currently being targeted by a man with a resort concept and a very large acquisition budget. Madeline had noticed that Charles and I were spending time together outside the hospital. A neighbor had seen us leaving in the car that Wednesday evening and mentioned it. That, combined with the failed capacity evaluation, seemed to accelerate whatever timeline she and Preston had been working from. Things started disappearing. First, it was a sum of money from Charles's personal spending account, not large but documented. Then a pocket watch that had belonged to Charles's father, a piece he had shown me once with the quietness people use when something matters more than they want to admit, turned up missing from the chest in his bedroom. Then Madeline's lawyer contacted me to say that a copy of a Whitaker property deed had been found in my vehicle during a visit to the house to collect Madeline's remaining belongings. I hadn't put it there. I had no reason to have a copy of that deed, but I also couldn't prove in the moment that it had been planted. And that was precisely the point. The accusations didn't have to hold up in court. They just had to hold up long enough to create the impression that I was exactly the person Madeline had been describing for months. She called a gathering at the house. Several of Charles's relatives came, people I had known well enough, people who had had no reason to distrust me before this, and she laid it out in front of all of them. The missing money, the watch, the deed in my car. She said I had spent months cultivating access to a dying man for the express purpose of positioning myself to inherit what his own daughter was entitled to. She said it with steady, pained conviction. The conviction of someone who has rehearsed a version of events long enough that it starts to feel true to them. I stood there and didn't perform. I said what I knew to be true and said it once, and then I stopped talking, because repeating yourself in a room that has already decided feels less like defense and more like confession. What broke something in me was Charles's silence afterward. When I went to him and told him what had happened, he listened, asked 2 brief questions about which specific documents were involved, and then said nothing more on the subject. I had expected some signal, not necessarily a declaration, but some indication that he knew what I knew. Instead, I got the same stillness I had seen in him the night he understood what his daughter was actually doing. I began to think that maybe Madeline's version had reached him in some form and had planted doubt in a place I couldn't see. Not knowing felt worse than almost anything else that had happened. I started putting things in boxes. I didn't make an announcement about it. I just began methodically moving what was mine into containers stacked near the door. It was a practical acknowledgement of what the situation had become. The house wasn't mine. The legal ground was uncertain. Then Charles called me into his room. It was late. The hospital floor was quiet, and he was propped up on 2 pillows looking tired in the way of someone who has been thinking instead of sleeping. He told me to sit down. He didn't address the gathering or the deed or the missing watch. He looked at me for a long moment, and then asked if he died without leaving me anything at all, would I regret having spent all those months there? I told him no. He asked whether it would change my answer if the house ended up with Madeline. I told him it wouldn't. He asked what my answer would be if by tomorrow everyone who knew me still believed the things Madeline was saying. I thought about it not because I was uncertain, but because the question deserved the weight of an honest answer rather than a fast one. Then I told him that he knew who I was, and that for me that was enough. Charles closed his eyes. He didn't say anything after that. He didn't have to. I sat with him until his breathing steadied and evened out into sleep, and then I drove back to the house, stood in the room with my half-packed boxes, and understood something I hadn't quite put into words before. I wasn't staying to win anything. I wasn't staying to be proven right. The boxes could wait. I unpacked them the next morning. Charles declined faster after that. The respiratory episodes came closer together. The good days got shorter. Madeline and Preston, I heard through Margaret, had scheduled a meeting with their own legal team to finalize the paperwork they intended to file the moment Charles's death was officially recorded. They were ready. Everything was in order on their side. Charles called me to his bedside on a Thursday night in late spring, and he tried to say something and he couldn't find the breath for it. I took his hand. I told him he didn't have to say anything. I told him I was there. He died before Madeline made it back to the hospital. She had been called. She had been given enough time. But something, the drive from Baltimore or the decision about when to leave or something I would never fully understand, meant she wasn't in the room. I was. That was the last thing Charles and I shared, and it was enough. What came after was swift and organized and felt nothing like grief. Madeline's lawyer contacted me within 24 hours, requesting my formal departure from the property. Preston's team arrived to survey the shipyard lot within 48 hours of the death certificate being processed. The relatives who had attended Madeline's gathering went quiet in the final way people go quiet when they're certain a verdict has been issued, and they'd rather not be seen near the losing side. I was loading the last of my boxes into my truck when Dale called. I answered because I thought he was checking in the way a friend does after something like this. His voice was careful from the first sentence. He said he'd been hearing more things, that the story Madeline was telling had gotten specific and detailed and was circulating in places where it was going to affect my reputation in the trade. He said he had defended me as long as he could, but that he wasn't in a position to keep doing it without it costing him professionally. He said, "I'm sorry, Aaron. I just can't keep standing out there for you." I sat in the truck after the call ended and didn't go anywhere for a long time. The rain came in off the bay and hit the windshield in the way it does when the storm is coming from the east. Not dramatic, just persistent and gray and indifferent to whatever was happening in the cab of a pickup on the far side of the marina parking lot. I thought about all of it. The months in that hospital. The medication charts and the breathing episodes and the conversations at 2 in the morning when Charles couldn't sleep. The envelope with his handwriting on it. The training center that didn't exist yet. I thought, this is what it looks like when you lose everything at once. The marriage was gone. The man I had called family was gone. The one friend who had kept saying he believed me had just told me he was done. The house was no longer mine, and the story everyone was telling had no version in which I was anything other than a con artist who had failed. I sat in that truck and understood for the first time in those entire months that I might have been wrong to stay. Not wrong in the way that matters, not morally, not in the place where I knew myself, but wrong in the practical sense that sometimes the world does not reward the thing you thought was right. Sometimes you do the right thing, and the story still ends with you in a parking lot in the rain with no job, no home, no marriage, and no one left who will say your name without flinching. I had believed that Charles knowing who I was would be enough. Sitting in that truck, I was no longer entirely sure. Margaret Doyle called me 4 days after the funeral. She didn't explain much on the phone. She said Charles had left specific instructions about the sequencing of his estate matters, and that those instructions required everyone involved to be present at the shipyard before any legal documents were formally opened or acted upon. She asked if I would come. I said yes, mostly because I didn't have a reason not to, and partly because the shipyard was the last place Charles and I had gone together, and I wasn't entirely ready to let that be the end of it. I drove down on a Tuesday morning. The weather was the kind of overcast that sits low over the bay and makes the water look like pewter. I parked along the far edge of the lot away from the dock and sat for a moment before going in. The building looked the same as it had that Wednesday night in spring, the weathered paint, the solid bones, the dock that needed work. I had spent enough time around old structures to know the difference between a building that was giving up and one that was simply waiting. Inside, Madeline was already there. She was standing near the far wall with her arms crossed, wearing the kind of composed expression that requires effort to maintain, the kind that looks like confidence from a distance and looks like bracing from up close. Preston had not come himself, but he had sent 3 members of his legal team who had formally filed notice of interest in the Whitaker property as part of an active acquisition process. Margaret had permitted their presence on that basis. They had standing as registered interested parties in the transaction. They sat at a table to one side with folders open in front of them, and the particular efficiency of people who have been paid to be ready for a specific outcome. They had come prepared to close a deal. Margaret stood at the center of the room behind the old wooden desk that had been there since Charles's father ran operations. She looked at me when I came in, gave me a brief nod, and waited until everyone had settled before she spoke. She said that Charles had given her clear instructions. Before any estate documentation was opened, reviewed, or acted upon, she was required to read a letter he had written and sealed in her presence while he was fully competent and witnessed. She produced the envelope I had watched Charles address that night, the same handwriting, the same deliberate letters. To be opened after I am gone. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded 2 pages of his personal stationery. The room went very quiet. Margaret read it the way Charles would have wanted it read, without performance, without theatrics. Just the words in the order he had written them, given exactly the weight they carried on their own. Charles wrote that he had spent the final chapter of his life paying attention, not to the business of dying, which he found tedious, but to the people around him. He wrote that he had always believed family was a thing you were born into and that it held together through obligation and proximity. He wrote that the past several months had changed his mind about that in ways he hadn't anticipated and hadn't fully welcomed, because they had required him to see his daughter clearly rather than the way he had always preferred to see her. He wrote about Madeline with the careful restraint of a man who had loved someone long enough to be devastated by them without becoming cruel. He said she was his blood, and that he would not stop being her father even now. But he said he had watched her in the final months of his life treat the question of his death primarily as a logistical problem, something to be positioned around, rather than something to be present for. He said he had heard her from his hospital bed tell the man who had been caring for him that she had spent enough time living someone else's life. He said those words had done something in him that he hadn't found a way to undo. Then he wrote about me. I didn't use my name at first. He described a series of actions, the 4 in the morning calls to the care team, the medication charts, the evenings in the shipyard office the night I had told him that what was happening between me and Madeline didn't change the fact that he needed someone there. He described a conversation where he had asked me 3 questions in sequence and had gotten 3 answers that told him everything he needed to know about why I was still in that room. He wrote that those answers had not been strategic. He wrote that he had spent enough of his life around calculating people to know the difference between a man who was performing loyalty and a man who simply was it. Then he wrote the sentence that Margaret read without inflection and that landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I name Aaron Fletcher, not as the son-in-law my daughter gave me, but as the son his own character allowed me to choose. I heard Madeline draw a breath beside me. One of Preston's legal team reached for a pen and held it without writing anything. Margaret continued without looking up. And I name him the steward of everything I built to outlive me. I didn't move. I had spent enough months in hospital rooms learning to stay still when everything around me was shifting, and that training held now even when what was shifting was the entire structure of what I had believed this day was going to be. I had not come to that room expecting anything. I had come because Margaret asked, and because Charles had earned my presence even after he was gone. What I was hearing did not fit inside any expectation I'd had, so I had nothing to do with it except let it settle. Madeline turned to look at me. The composed surface had cracked along a seam. I recognized the seam where calculated calm meets genuine shock. Preston's lead counsel was already speaking quietly to the man beside him. Margaret set the letter down and opened the folder beside it. The estate documents Charles had finalized were structured around a single vehicle, the Whitaker Harbor Trust. The shipyard property, the waterfront house, and the majority of his remaining assets had been transferred into this trust before his death structured so that they could not be sold, subdivided, or redirected for purposes inconsistent with Charles's written intent. The trust named a primary steward responsible for executing that intent. That name was Aaron Fletcher. The waterfront house transferred to me directly along with a portion of Charles's personal assets. Madeline was provided with a separate financial allocation structured, funded, and sufficient for a stable life, but with no authority over the trust property and no ability to transfer or sell the shipyard land. Preston's legal team sat with their folders open and had nothing left to close. Margaret then said she had one additional matter to address. She produced a second set of documents, an audit she and Charles had commissioned through an independent financial investigator over the preceding 4 months. The audit had been quietly ongoing since Charles became aware that financial information was being passed to Preston's acquisition team. She laid out the findings methodically. Data points about the Whitaker estate had been transmitted to Preston's team through a channel originating with someone who had access to the family's internal financial records. The transmission had begun nearly a year before Charles was diagnosed, before I had started spending time at the hospital, before any of it had given Madeline a reason to point at me and say the problem had a name. The suspicious transactions attributed to me traced through the audit to financial activity connected to a consultant in Preston's acquisitions network. The paper trail did not include me. The pocket watch, Charles's father's watch, the one that had supposedly gone missing, had been deposited by Charles himself into a safety deposit box at a bank branch in Annapolis 8 weeks before his death. He had done it on a Tuesday afternoon alone without telling anyone, because he understood that something in that house was being staged, and he wanted to see how the staging played out. I had wanted to know whether I would leave when the pressure became unbearable, or whether I would stay anyway, knowing I couldn't prove my innocence, knowing the room had already decided. He had watched me pack those boxes. He had called me back in. He had asked me 3 questions, listened to 3 answers, and understood from those answers what he needed to understand before he decided what to do with the remainder of his life's work. He had not protected me in the moment, because protecting me in the moment would have told him less than watching me stand in it did. I sat with that for a while. The idea that those weeks, the gathering at the house, Madeline's accusations, Dale's phone call in the rain, had all taken place inside a frame Charles had already built and was watching from a distance. The idea that the hardest thing I had gone through in that whole long year had also been the thing that told him everything he needed to know. I wasn't sure whether to feel grateful for that or something more complicated. In the end, I landed somewhere between the two, a kind of understanding that didn't require resolution, the way you understand certain things about the people you love only after you've stopped needing them to be different than they were. Preston Langford left Annapolis without speaking to me. His legal team departed with the same brisk efficiency with which they had arrived, except now the efficiency was pointed in the opposite direction. Within 2 weeks of the reading, I heard from Margaret that Preston had formally withdrawn his interest in the waterfront property. Without access to the Whitaker Trust land, the resort development had no viable footprint. The project was dead. Without the deal, Madeline was simply a woman who had provided useful information and who now had no more useful information to provide. Whatever Preston had offered her, the role in his company, the life in Baltimore, quietly ceased to be on offer once the trust documents closed the door on the shipyard. I heard about this secondhand. I did not feel the thing I might have expected to feel. I was too busy. The Whitaker Harbor Trust had a steward, and that steward had a set of intentions to execute. I spent the first month working through the specifics with Margaret, understanding the legal structure, understanding what Charles had already put in place and what still needed to be built. The vocational training center had been more developed in his planning than I had known. He had already spoken to the community colleges, already drafted partnership agreements with the Veterans Organization, already gotten informal commitments from 6 retired shipyard craftsmen who had worked alongside him for decades, and who were, as it turned out, waiting for someone to make a phone call and tell them it was finally happening. I made those phone calls. The renovation of the old Whitaker Marine Works took most of a year. I did a significant portion of the restoration work myself. It was what I knew how to do, and there was something right about using my hands on a building that Charles had built with his. The dock was rebuilt. The workshop floor was refinished. New ventilation went in for the welding and metalwork stations. An exterior wall on the east side, the one that faced the water, was converted to windows because Charles had always said the best thing about working in that building was the light off the bay in the morning, and the people who came to learn there should have the same thing he'd had. The first class ran 11 months after the trust was formally activated. 14 students, 8 of them, veterans 3, the children of former Whitaker workers, 3 referred through a workforce development program in the county. 2 of the retired craftsmen came back to teach. One of them, a man named Roy, who had run the joinery shop for 22 years, told me on the first day that he hadn't thought anyone was actually going to do it. He said Charles had mentioned the plan years ago, and he'd figured it was the kind of thing people talk about without ever following through. I told him Charles wasn't really that kind of person. Roy said no, he wasn't. Then he walked into the workshop and got to work the way men like him always do. I put Charles's letter in a frame and hung it in the office that used to be his, the same desk, the same chair, the same window looking out toward the water. I didn't frame the section about the estate or the naming. I framed one sentence, the one that sat at the end of the letter, after all the legal language was finished. Family is not the person entitled to your name. Family is the person who stays when there is nothing left to gain. Madeline came to the shipyard on a Thursday afternoon, about 8 months after the trust had been formalized. I saw her car in the lot before I saw her, a practical sedan, nothing like the life she had been assembling in Baltimore. She was standing near the entrance when I came out of the workshop, and she looked the way people look when they are not sure they have the right to be somewhere but have come anyway. She asked if she could see what her father had built. I held the door open and let her walk in. She moved through the space slowly. She looked at the windows on the east wall and the light coming off the water and the students at their stations and the retired craftsmen moving between them with the patient authority of people who know exactly what they're doing. She looked at the frame on the office wall. She stood in front of it for a long time. When she turned around, her eyes were wet, and her face had the particular openness of someone who has run out of the energy required to hold a version of themselves together. She didn't say what she had expected to find here, but whatever it was, this wasn't it. This was something her father had wanted badly enough to plan for years and trusted to someone else to finish, and it was real, and it was working, and his name was on the wall in letters the students saw every morning when they came in. I let her have the moment without filling it. After a while, she said she was sorry. She said it simply without the scaffolding of explanation or justification that would have made it easier to deliver and harder to mean. Just the 2 words in the voice of someone who had been carrying them for a long time and had finally found the right place to set them down. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "He wanted this to continue. That's all." I went back into the workshop. She was gone by the time I came out again. I did not stand at the door and watch her leave. I did not spend time on what might have been different or what I would have changed. I had learned in the year behind me that you could release someone from what they had done without returning to what you had been together. Those were different actions that led to different places, and I was clear about which one I was capable of. That evening, I walked out to the end of the dock after the students had gone. The lights from the workshop reflected off the Chesapeake in long, broken lines, the way light looks on moving water present and shifting at the same time. The bay was doing what the bay does, moving indifferent, older than all of it. I had thought for a long time that the best thing Charles would leave me was the memory of who he was. And then in the rain in that parking lot, I had been certain the answer was nothing, that I would walk away with less than I had come in with, and that the story would always belong to the people who had told it loudest. Neither of those turned out to be right. What Charles left me was not money or property, though those things came too. What he left me was a name, his name on a trust, my name on a letter, the names of retired craftsmen on a teaching schedule, the names of 14 people in a first cohort who didn't yet know what the next year was going to give them. He left me a responsibility that was bigger than I was, and that would take longer than I had planned for. He left me a place to belong to. I had come to Annapolis as Madeline's husband. I had stayed as Charles's caretaker. I stood now on that dock as something I still didn't have a clean word for the man Charles had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with blood or law or a piece of paper signed in a county courthouse, and everything to do with a year of showing up when showing up was the only thing I had left to give. I think about that sometimes when I watch the students coming in each morning, the veterans learning to work with their hands again, the young people who needed a door to walk through, the craftsmen who thought they were done but found out they had more to teach. I think about how close I came to packing those boxes for good, how close I came to driving away from that hospital room and never going back, how different everything would look right now if I had made the easier choice every single time it was offered to me. Charles used to say that a man shows you who he is not in what he does when things are going well, but in what he does when everything is asking him to quit. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I had lived through the version of it that was designed specifically for me. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt true, then you already know that loyalty without conditions is one of the rarest things one person can offer another. Charles knew it. He spent the last months of his life looking for it. And when he found it, he made sure it outlived him. That's what the letter was. Not a legal document, not a reward. It was one man telling another, I saw you, and what I saw was worth leaving something behind for. That's all any of us are really asking for in the end, to be seen clearly by someone we respect, and to be found worthy of what they choose to leave in our hands. If that's a story worth watching, subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more of them coming.